Hello everyone, my name is Cassette, and today I will be discussing bedside digital tools and some of the major informatics concerns that affect nurse anesthesia practice. So during this presentation, I will first explain why bedside informatics is important in modern anesthesia practice. I will then discuss the standards and regulations that guide the use of digital technology, followed by the major legal and ethical concerns that arise when personal devices, mobile applications, and artificial intelligence are used in the operating room. Next, I'll examine both sides of the patient safety. Digital tools can help clinicians identify deterioration and respond consistently, but poorly designed systems can also create alert fatigue and distractions. I will also discuss security and privacy, how technology affects anesthesia workflow, and why digital literacy has become an important clinical skill. And finally, I will provide practical recommendations and walk through an example involving an inoperative hypotension alert. The main idea throughout this presentation is that bedside informatics should support the vigilance of the anesthesia provider rather than compete with it. So, why does bedside informatics matter? The modern operating room is a highly connected environment. During a single anesthetic, information may move between physiological monitors and electronic health records, the anesthesia information management system, infusion pumps, clinical decision support tools, and mobile applications. Clinical decision support can influence real-time decisions by identifying abnormal trends, providing reminders, and warning clinicians about potential risks. Mobile anesthesia applications can provide rapid access to medication doses, emergency algorithms, clinical calculators, and communication systems. Automation and non-invasive monitors are also changing how anesthesia is delivered. Technology can continuously collect information and identify patterns that may be difficult for a person to recognize immediately. However, the same technology can create new risks. Personal devices may divide attention between clinical and non-clinical activities. Poorly integrated systems may create additional documentation responsibilities. Connected devices may also expose protected patient information. And the central challenge is finding the balance between using technology to prevent harm and making sure that it does not distract them from direct patient care. Standards and regulations provide information protections, but they do not always provide detailed guidance for every digital tool used in anesthesia. HIPAA establishes expectations for protecting health information in the United States. The GDPR provides similar data protection in Europe. These regulations create a minimum standard for how patient information should be accessed, stored, and shared. Hospitals also develop institutional policies that address issues such as personal device use, electronic documentation, password security, photography, messaging, and access to medical records. Another important responsibility belongs to vendors. Before a device application algorithm is introduced into patient care, its accuracy, reliability, security, and ability to communicate with other systems should be evaluated. Interoperability is especially important. A device may collect useful information, but that information has limited value when it cannot be transferred accurately into the patient's records or shared with another healthcare system. Nurse anesthetists should therefore be involved in evaluating technology before it reaches the bedside. A tool should not be adopted simply because it is new or convenient. It should be clinically validated, secure, reliable, and appropriate for the anesthesia environment. Several legal and ethical concerns arise when technology is used during anesthesia care. The first concern is distraction. Vigilance is one of the most important responsibilities of the anesthesia provider. Personal phone use, text messages, social media, or unrelated browsing during a case should be viewed as a failure to maintain attention, especially if an adverse event occurs. Digital activity can also become part of a legal investigation. Device records, application use, browsing history, and electronic messages may be viewed during malpractice litigation. Another concern is accountability. Artificial intelligence and clinical decision support may recommend a medication, predict hypotension, or identify an abnormal event. However, the clinician may remain responsible for evaluating that recommendation. An algorithm does not assume responsibility for the outcome. Consent and transparency are also important. Patients may not fully understand how their interoperative data are collected, stored, shared, or later used for research or system development. Equity must also be considered. Some facilities have access to advanced monitoring and decision support, while others may lack the financial or technical resources to implement them. Ultimately, technologies should be treated as a clinical assistant. It can support decision making, but it should never become the final authority over the anesthesia provider's judgment. When digital systems are designed and implemented appropriately, they can provide several important patient safety benefits. Early warning systems can identify changes in blood pressure, oxygenation, ventilation, or other physiological trends before severe deterioration occurs. And these alerts may give the anesthesia provider additional time to evaluate the patient and intervene. Clinical decision support can also standardize responses to common risks. For example, systems can provide reminders about antibiotic administration, medication allergies, appropriate monitoring, anesthetic depth, or the need for post-operative nausea and vomiting prevention. Incident reporting systems are another valuable informatics tool. When clinicians report adverse events and near misses, departments can analyze the information for repeated patterns. This allows an organization to address a hazard before it affects another patient. Automated documentation will also improve safety by transferring data directly from monitors and devices into the anesthesia record. This can reduce misinformation and allow the anesthesia provider to focus more attention on the patient. However, the goal should not simply be to generate more warnings or collect more data. The goal is to provide the right information at the right time so that the clinician can recognize risk and act effectively. Although informatics can improve patient safety, poorly designed systems can create new hazards. One of the most common problems is alert fatigue. When clinicians receive repeated warnings that are irrelevant, low priority, or inaccurate, they may begin dismissing alerts automatically. Eventually, an important alert may be ignored along with the unnecessary ones. Cognitive overload is another concern. An anesthesia provider may be watching several monitors, responding to alarms, documenting medications, communicating with the surgical team, and managing the airway at the same time. Crowded displays and stimulus notifications can make it more difficult to identify the most urgent problem. Personal devices create a unique risk because the same phone or tablet may contain both useful clinical applications and non-clinical notifications. A provider may open the device to check a medication dose but become distracted by a message or another application. Unreliable output is also dangerous. Algorithms may be affected by poor quality data, biased programming, software bugs, or inaccurate patient information. A confident-looking recommendation may still be incorrect. For these reasons, protecting the clinician's attention should be considered a patient safety intervention. Technology should organize information, prioritize important warnings, and reduce unnecessary interruptions. Security and privacy concerns increase as more devices become connected to hospital networks. Anesthesia records contain highly sensitive information, including diagnosis, medication histories, airway assessment, physiological data, surgical information, and responses to treatment. This information may move through hospital networks, cloud services, connected pumps, wearable monitors, mobile devices, and third-party vendor platforms. Every additional connection may improve convenience, but it also creates another possible point of unauthorized access. Some of the most common weaknesses are related to human behavior. Examples include weak passwords, shared logins, leaving screens unlocked, sending patient information through unapproved messaging platforms, and storing information on personal devices. Personal photography is another major concern. A photography taken in the operating room may unintentionally capture the patient's name, medical record number, surgical site, monitoring screen, or another identifying detail. Third-party vendors must also be evaluated because patient information may pass through systems that are not controlled directly by the hospital. Protecting privacy, therefore, requires more than an encryption and cybersecurity software. It also requires clear policies, secure habits, appropriate access controls, vendor oversight, and continued staff education. A digital tool may appear effective during development but still fails when introduced into the operating room. Successful implementation begins by identifying a specific clinical problem. The organization should ask what issue the technology is intended to solve. It may be designed to reduce documentation errors, recognize hypotension earlier, improve medication safety, or support communication. The frontline anesthesia provider should then be involved in the design and evaluation process. They understand the pace of the operating room and can identify when a new system adds unnecessary steps or interferes with existing responsibilities. Training must also be appropriate for every role. Anesthesia providers, nurses, technicians, and physicians may interact with the same system differently. Generally, training may not be prepared for each group for its specific responsibilities. Support should be available during the rollout, especially when the system is first used during real patient care. Problems that do not appear during classroom training may become obvious during a stressful case. And finally, the organization should evaluate whether the technology actually improved care. Measures may include time spent documenting, number of errors, alert responses, clinical satisfaction, and patient outcomes. Technology should adapt to the clinical workflow whenever possible. The clinician should not have to redesign safe patient care practices simply to accommodate a poorly designed system. Digital literacy is more than knowing how to open an application or enter information into an electronic record. A digital literal nurse anesthetist understands the purpose of a tool, how it functions, what information it uses, and what its limitations may be. Clinicians should receive practice using technology within realistic anesthesia scenarios. It is easier to learn how an alert system works during a simulation than during an actual emergency. Digital literacy also involves knowing when to question or override technology. For example, if a monitor displays a value that does not match the patient's clinical presentation, the provider should assess the equipment, examine the patient, and verify the information before treating the display number. Clinicians should also know how to report software failures, inaccurate alerts, near misses, and unsafe workarounds. Reporting allows organizations to correct problems that might otherwise remain hidden. Technology continues to change rapidly, so training cannot occur only when a person is hired. Ongoing education is necessary whenever systems are updated or new devices are introduced. Digital literacy is therefore a patient safety skill because it helps the anesthesia provider determine when to trust, verify, and question, override, and report information produced by a digital system. Several practical strategies can support safer technologies used in nurse anesthesia. First, facilities should establish clear boundaries for personal device use. Clinical use may be appropriate, but non-clinical activities should be avoided during patient care responsibilities, especially during induction, emergence and airway management, and periods of instability. Second, applications and algorithms should be evaluated before clinical use. Popularity does not guarantee accuracy. Tools should be reviewed for reliability, evidence, data security, and applicability to the patient population. Third, alerts should be carefully designed. High priority warnings should be easy to identify, while unnecessary or repeated low value alerts should be reduced. Fourth, protected health information must remain secure. This requires approved communication platforms, individual login credentials, secure storage, automatic screen locking, and review of third-party vendors. Fifth, training should be continuous and specific to the provider's role. Nurse anesthetists should understand both the function and limitations of each system. And finally, organizations should evaluate the impact of new tools after implementation. They should measure whether the technology reduced errors, saved time, improved satisfaction, or introduced unexpected problems. Safe adoption requires a combination of policy, thoughtful design, education, and continued measurements. This example demonstrates how clinical decision support should be used without replacing clinical judgment. Imagine that a predictive system alerts the nurse anesthetist that the patient is at risk for hypotension. The first step is not to immediately administer a medication. The provider should verify the information. This includes reviewing the blood pressure trend, checking the cuff position or arterial line waveform, assessing the patient's heart rate, evaluating anesthetic depth, and considering possible blood loss or decreased circulating volume. The provider should also consider the surgical situation. For example, hypertension may be related to induction medications, positioning, hemorrhaging, sympathetic blockade, excessive anesthetic depth, or decreased venous return. And after evaluating the likely cause, the nurse anesthetist can choose an appropriate intervention. This may include reducing the anesthetic concentration, administering a vasopressor, giving fluids, adjusting patient positioning, or communicating with the surgical team about possible bleed. The provider should then document the event and the response. If the alert was inaccurate, delayed, or repeatedly unnecessary, that information should be reported. The key point is that the alert begins the assessment process. It does not make the final treatment decision. In conclusion, bedside technology has become inseparable from modern nurse anesthesia practice. Digital tools can provide faster access to information, improve documentation, identify dangerous trends, support communication, and help clinicians respond to preoperative risk. However, technology can also create distractions, alert fatigue, privacy concerns, cybersecurity vulnerabilities, and workflow burdens. Automated recommendations may appear objective, but they can still be affected by poor data bias or software failure. Nurse anesthetists are positioned between powerful technology and vulnerable patients. Because of this, they must remain active decision makers rather than passive users of digital systems. Technology should be used when it improves information, supports vigilance, and strengthens patient safety. It should be questioned when its output conflicts with the patient's assessment or does not make clinical sense. Organizations also have a responsibility to govern technology through clear policies, proper training, secure systems, frontline involvement, and ongoing evaluation. The goal is not to resist innovation. The goal is to adopt innovation responsibly while maintaining the nurse anesthetist's primary responsibility to protect the patient. Here I'm providing the scholarly sources that support the information discussed throughout the presentation, and thank you for listening.